Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 309, and I'm your host, Eric Worrell. And today, we're going to be talking about David versus Goliath. Yeah, that's the story that a lot of us know from biblical times, but we're going to be talking about this in terms of landlords versus tenants and why it always feels like a David versus Goliath scenario, and maybe where some of the misconceptions are coming from and why that's creating such an issue right now. We're going to get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your host, Eric Worrell.
So I'll be honest, I feel like I'm breaking a lot of rules here today because I've already had a religious reference, and now we're going to get into some political talk, but it's hard not to get around political talk these days with what's going on with COVID-19, and especially as it pertains to landlords and real estate investors. So I came across an interesting article. The title was Landlords on the Pandemic. Everyone has an impression of us as rich and greedy. This came from theguardian.com, was posted on Monday, April 20th by Poppy Noor. And the article I thought was pretty interesting, and it kind of reminded me of a conversation that comes up routinely on the podcast, which is essentially this kind of David versus Goliath. It's talking about it in the same way, where it's saying that there's this rich and greedy kind of impression of landlords. And what I've always said is that the landlord-tenant relationship is really interesting because, you may have a relationship between a boss and an employee, but it's not quite as impactful, in my opinion, as the relationship between a landlord and a tenant. Typically, you might have something that comes up at work and there's disagreements or there's frustrations or there's things that, might drive you up the wall, but it's not to the level of things that can happen at your home. So let's say the heat fails and the landlord's trying to do their best to get it fixed, but, they can't get their normal guy to come out, their HVAC guy to look at it and having issues or whatever it may be. But that is a really serious problem for the tenant. Like if they don't have heat and it's cold, or, depending on where you are in the country, if you don't have AC and it's, sweltering hot. These are things that feel like life or death type things, right? That amygdala brain, they call it the lizard brain by the back of your neck, the stem of your neck there, the stem of the brain, I should say, kind of kicks in and you stop kind of, having the ability to have rational thought and everything just becomes emotional reaction. So one of the things, though, that is a common theme that we always talk about is the David versus Goliath, right? Goliath is a landlord, David is the tenant, and these landlords are rich and greedy, and they're just kind of, just out there to do what's best for them and not take care of their tenants. Well, this article, I thought, kind of talks about this pretty well. I wanted to read some of it to you and kind of give some thoughts. So it opens up and it says the coronavirus pandemic has brought mass unemployment to prevent a spate of homelessness. Governors across the U.S. have promised moratoriums on evictions and mortgage forgiveness for those who can't keep up with their payments. But many renters say the protections do not go far enough, and some are threatening rent strikes. I've read that in New York City, that's one of the most prevalent areas, obviously because it's been hit so hard with the virus, but that there's a major movement for rent strikes on May 1st. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But Ricardo Reese, who owns 16 properties in Michigan, so not a small landlord, he says there is a stigma against landlords, which means people are less empathetic about their needs during such time. Everyone has an impression of us being rich and greedy, and a lot of tenants will be thinking, how can they ask us to pay rent during this time? But in reality, there are costs involved. So if you're listening to this, you're well aware, right? Maybe this is just more cathartic to hear from somebody else. But he's talking about those costs, including property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and mortgage payments. And although homeowners will be provided with mortgage relief during the pandemic, many renters are wondering why they should still pay rent. But plenty aren't aware that the commercial property owners, landlords in other words, are not entitled to this benefit. Furthermore, forbearance programs only defer mortgage payments rather than completely forgiving the cost. So that's interesting because maybe something that seems obvious to you that, hey, I am not getting mortgage relief, and these, even if you were getting any kind of relief, it's still going to have to be paid up, these deferred mortgage payments. It may not be obvious to your tenant. So they may just be thinking, and you know what, to give you a little personal story, I'm dealing with this at daycare. For me, at daycare, they're still charging us a 50% fee for the to hold our kid's spot, even though we're not using the service, which, kind of stinks, right? It's $1,000 a month to essentially not use this service. But one of the issues that I'm having with the daycare service is I don't feel like I'm getting good communication from them on what they're trying to do with different programs that are available. And frankly, I don't know what programs are available to them as a non-for-profit. I don't know if that's different than a for-profit business. I'm not, a business advisor who's specialized on these loans, but I know there's the PPP loan where I believe, and I'm trying to get you into the mind of a tenant by sharing this story, because I feel like I'm playing the tenant in this particular case because I'm the one paying for this service. So I believe that there's an opportunity that they could get these small business loans and then have a certain amount of months, I don't know if it's 3-4 months, where the salary of their employees will be covered. And it's based on not losing employees. And it's also based on not having like dramatic changes to your payroll, right? Like you can't just all of a sudden cut your employees' payroll at 10% of what they used to make and then still have these loans come in and not have to pay them back. So in my opinion, what's happening from an outsider's point of view without having any idea what's actually going on is they're not taking advantage of these opportunities at the daycare like some other daycares are. And to make that worse, what they're doing is they're still charging people for a service they're not using. And what I believe they could be doing is taking advantage of these loans, keeping their staff on, and then not charging people that are still going to use their service in the future when this opens back up for not using it. So in an ideal scenario, to me, that would be best, right? Their clients, me, other parents, aren't being charged for a service they're not using. Their employees are getting paid their normal payroll amount, and the business gets this kind of 3-4 month window to see if it can straighten back out and get things rolling. Well, all of this, there might be a really simple explanation for it. It might just be like, hey, we're a non-for-profit and we don't qualify for that, or you know what, there's this thing, and that's the reason why we can't take advantage of that, and that's why you guys still need to pay 50%. But when that's not communicated and I'm in a position where I just don't understand, then really where my brain goes is like, why are they charging us for this? This is crap, right? So I think that sometimes your tenants might be in a similar position where they're just thinking, hey, like my landlord doesn't have to pay his mortgage payments. Why do I have to pay rent payments? This is ridiculous. Like, why is he getting, relief and I'm not? Well, it might just be as simple as your tenant doesn't understand that you're not getting mortgage relief, right? You're a commercial landlord. You're not getting any kind of relief on maybe the mortgage that you have set up. And being able to communicate that to them via letter or whatever it may be might be a really helpful way to get everybody on the same page. They may not like what you have to say, but it might at least educate them a little bit further than they are right now. So I think that was worth mentioning. So we'll get back to the article though here. So the article continues on. It says that they are seeing this as an opportunity as opposed to asking for help and relief. To inflict damage on the landlord is some sort of class warfare, says Jay Martin, the executive director of community housing improvement in New York. Many landlords say this class warfare view, the moneyed landlord versus the renter, is misguided. Reese, who also manages properties on behalf of a property management company, says the renters are used to a faceless landlord and don't realize that on the other side is a family looking to pay the mortgage. Tenants have misconceptions that landlords make a lot of money because they think that what they pay goes straight to the landlord's pocket, says Reese. In his state, he says most make less than what is presumed. So I thought this was interesting, but he shares that in Michigan, landlords make around $200 to $300 per month for each property after expenses are accounted for. He adds that the risk landlords take on is high. They take on the loan, risk foreclosure if they can't pay the mortgage, and could potentially lose everything. It's an extremely risky proposition, and they say with risk comes a little bit of reward. And in this case, that's dependent on their tenant making their payment on time. Now, I don't know if you could do the same thing I do when you read something and you hear somebody talk and you kind of like get an idea of the slant and the angle that they have. There's a little bit of a slant here, obviously. He's talking about how this is super high risk and there's little reward. A little bit of reward is the phrasing used. And, I just don't like, it's like, this isn't like high. If it's high risk with a little bit of reward and for all the pain in the butt aspects of being a landlord, it's not worth it, right? I don't think it's just a little bit of reward. I think there's a lot of long-term reward to being a landlord, right? But of course, this is a heated time. So just like tenants are heated, landlords can be heated too. But Reese believes that most tenants won't pay their rent if they don't have to, and so criticizes the government for leaving landlords with that risk by offering eviction moratoriums. So forgive me, I don't recall off the top of my head. I forget if it's 90 days. I feel like everything's changing so fast, but there's essentially a freeze on evictions. And I do agree with this, that there is a certain subset of tenants that when they hear that are like, oh, like my landlord, that one like piece of leverage that they had on me being a good tenant and paying on time was just removed. So I can do whatever I want for the next 2-3 months. And I'm sure there are cases where that's happening. Hopefully it's not as widespread as some believe. But, if you do have, that small minority that are looking for, leverage, you gave a lot of leverage to a tenant when that was imposed. And I get why they did it. You want the basis covered when you have a crisis like this happen. You don't want people worried about, am I going to be able to afford to live? I'm going to have a place to live? Am I going to be able to afford groceries and those kind of things? And that's why these, governmental moratoriums have been put in place. But it definitely changes the power dynamic between the landlord and tenant by taking away that leverage that the landlord has, and maybe a unscrupulous tenant might take advantage of that. So he's saying, furthermore, that the state is trying to put in the landlords to house individuals for free. And he said that the government should instead bolster social housing if they believe that people should live rent free. I think the tough thing about that is like this could be a very temporary thing. Maybe you're looking 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever it may be. But to all of a sudden bolster social housing in 6 months is difficult. But from my understanding, a lot of these contractors that I've talked to over the past month, a lot of them cannot work on commercial projects. So one of them being, we got a new office at RentPrep, and that has been put on hold. Our contractors cannot work on that, but they did say that they had a HUD project that they were working on that they're allowed to work on, so they can work on that. I also have a friend who paints for commercially, and he said that they're only allowed to paint on these commercial properties. So for Mr. Reese from Michigan, he says that he understands people might look at 16 homes as a lot, but he says for a true real estate investor, it's not a lot. He says that his wife is a school teacher. And yeah, if you're like in the point where, you still have a lot of mortgage payments left ahead of you, 16, properties might sound like a lot, but it's a lot that you're responsible for right now. So I completely agree with that. And I think sometimes it's easy. You have your narrative, your story in your head of what you want to believe. So if it's the tenant and you're like, these are rich and greedy people, and you're like, this guy owns 16 properties. It's like, no, he doesn't. Like the bank owns like 80, 75% of them still, and he's still paying for that. So that is definitely something to consider. So it says that they only band together for a very short time until the first eviction paper comes through. Then I think it'll hit home, says Margialis. He owns 4 properties in LA and still has a mortgage on each of them. And he says his property taxes cost him between $500 and $1,000 per property. So this is Greg Margialis, a landlord in LA, is not worried about the rent strikes because he does think that eventually this will all work its way out. But he does empathize with the fact that there are currently millions out of work, and he stresses that most landlords want to work with tenants to keep them in their properties, not to work against them. He has made arrangements with one tenant who could only pay partial rent and another who had to defer payment. But that sympathy can only go so far, he says. At the same time, they still have to stay in the unit. You have a safe place to sleep. You're away from the virus. It's unfortunate you're not working, but you should have to have nothing to do with paying for what you're used to or what you used. You still have to pay for gas. You still have to pay for groceries. Asked what message he would give renters thinking of striking, he advises them to keep in contact with their landlord. We are not blind to what's going on in the world. We see that the world has been turned upside down. We're willing to work with tenants, but if you ignore the landlord thinking it's going to go away, it's not. So that's, two-way street, right? You don't want to just ignore the tenant and hope they do the right thing and pay the rent. I think one of the things that I've learned over the last year is on expectations and the difference between an expectation and an agreement. So an expectation is something that you place on somebody else, and an agreement is something that you come together on as two people. And I've experienced this a lot of times where You get into a new endeavor, you have an expectation of what it's going to be, and then you feel disappointment when that expectation isn't fulfilled, but really you never communicated to that other person or entity what your expectation was. So I think that there's going to be some of that happening right now with tenants and landlords, where the tenant has this expectation of like, of course I'm not going to pay rent. And the landlord has an expectation of course they're going to pay rent. And you can see how that's going to cause some issues. So I think getting away from expectations and getting towards agreements is helpful. If you research, I think it's Lencioni. I'll look that up. Let me see here. Lencioni, kind of a business guru guy who's Patrick Lencioni, American writer. And if you look up Patrick Lencioni and expectations versus agreements, I will put some content into the show notes today if you're interested in that. I think it's really helpful just for any relationship you have with anybody that's critical, just like you would with your spouse or your tenant or a coworker. Super helpful stuff. So I'll put that in the show notes. So going forward, Reese from Michigan was talking about that reforms such as moratoriums or rent caps, which are intended to help the tenant, will always end up costing them as landlords cut corners to seek to make costs back. Moratoriums sound great right now, but come fall, we have to start changing how we screen tenants, he says. It opened up our eyes. We realized there's just not enough security if the government can freeze rents or put a moratorium in place and just leave us stranded. Martin says it is the behavior of renters rather than landlords that should concern people at the moment. What could be more greedy than withholding rent that you have the ability to pay and then damage the entire housing market and push it towards collapse? To me, it's incredibly short-sighted. All right. That's interesting take right there. But yeah, if it happens on a global scale, that's a certain possibility that if everyone decides to go on a rent strike, you're going to have some major issues, which we've covered in previous episodes. But I wanted to talk about this one, that idea, David versus Goliath, the rich, greedy landlord versus the poor tenant, this class warfare thing that always seems to kind of be popping up between that dynamic. But think about how you can improve communications. Kind of looking back at that story I was sharing, I think of, you look at other stories in your life maybe that kind of help you put yourself in the other person's shoes by seeing like, have I ever had this situation where I was in their shoes? And for me, that's like I was just saying, the daycare situation. I reached out to the daycare, said, hey, here's what I've got going on. What do you got going on? They've helped fill me in a little bit on that, and they've worked with us. So I think that there's an opportunity to kind of just think about, how do you put yourself in their shoes? And then how do you come to an agreement, or at least something closer to an agreement, rather than the tenant placing expectations on the landlord placing expectations on the tenant? And granted, there is an agreement, and it's called the lease, right? But when that lease was written, we weren't in a global pandemic, and nobody would have saw that coming or thought of that. So that lease, in my opinion, is from a very different time and age. So it's worth kind of coming up with some sort of agreement and understanding and communication with your tenants at this time to know what's going on and what your expectations are in the form of an agreement, and see if you can get to one. But hopefully you guys found that helpful. I found this article helpful. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. I hope you guys are doing well. I know it's kind of an up and down kind of feeling day to day, at least for me and a lot of the people I've been talking to and keeping in touch with. Even sometimes during the course of one day, everything's fine. And then, for me, it's little guys at home, and my wife has a meeting, I have a meeting, and then this one's crying and this one needs to be changed. And the interesting thing is everybody has their own unique combination of what they're dealing with right now. And I think that's good to remember, that everybody's got something else, some unique situation that they're dealing with, that as they're trying to process and navigate their new normal, and just kind of having some grace and some patience for each other, and just trying to be kind and reach out and connect with people. And that's why I like doing this podcast. I think it's an opportunity at least, just to have someone in your ear that's in your corner. And I appreciate you guys listening, and I hope you're doing well. All right, guys, until next week, have a great week and take care.